Hello everyone, welcome to Data Umbrellas webinar. I'm going to do a brief introduction and then I'll hand over the mic and camera to Joe to begin the webinar. So at the end of the webinar, we will have a question and answer session, but if you have any question in the course of the talk, please drop it in the chat. We have a Q&A section on the platform, so feel free to drop your questions at any time. This video will also be recorded and available on YouTube in the next 24 hours. Little about Data Umbrella is that we are a community for underrepresented persons in data science, and we are a nonprofit organization. About me, I am a data scientist from Nairobi, Kenya, and you can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and GitHub as Beryl Kanali. We have a code of conduct as Data Umbrella, and we want to thank you for helping make Data Umbrella a community that is friendly to all. You can support us in different ways. First is by following our code of conduct so that we can get folks coming back for more talks. You can also join our Discord community chat where you can ask questions, answer questions, share events, jobs, and other relevant materials. You can also donate to us. We are on Open Collective as Data Umbrella. We are also on Benevity, which is a company matched enabled platform where you make a donation and your company matches the same. For example, if you donate $100, your company will also match a donation of $100. We also have a YouTube channel where we have posted all our previous webinars, and you can find us on YouTube as Data Umbrella. Our YouTube page has different libraries. For example, we have a career advice playlist for folks interested in data science and tech in general. We also have other cool playlists like data visualization, contributing to open source, and PyMC and NumPy series. We have a newsletter on Substack. So we are on Substack as dataumbrella.substack.com. You can sign up and subscribe to our monthly newsletter, and we promise not to spam you. You can find resources on our website. Our website is dataumbrella.org, where we have resources on open source, AI ethics, guides to inclusive language and allyship, accessibility and responsibility, and many more. We are across all social media platforms. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, GitHub, Meetup as Data Umbrella, and we also have a blog as blog.dataumbrella.org, where you can find some cool articles. This webinar will have a live captioning. So for live viewers, you can get closed captionings on the right side of your screen. So feel free to use that. We are calling for volunteers to do the timestamps for this particular video. So if you're interested in contributing by adding timestamps to our intro to Django video, you're very welcome. Reshma will post the link to our GitHub issue where you'll be able to see what you can do and help. You don't have to add timestamps to the entire video. You can choose a section and contribute. So you don't have to do the whole video if you find it time consuming. So we have a GitHub issue. The link has been posted, so feel free. You can also drop a chat and say that you would like to work on that as well. For upcoming events this month, we have an event on June 14th on data visualization. You can find our events on meetup.com as Data Umbrella. So to today's talk, we have Joe, who's going to present about Intro to Django, and we're glad to have you. About Joe, Joe is a technologist, an educator, and an advocate for environmental and social justice. He has over a decade of experience as a software engineer and leader working at impact-focused organizations across multiple industries. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York, and is a graduate from General Assembly Web Development Bootcamp program. He is currently a senior software engineer at Square. He is also a co-founder of Sustainable Progress and Equality Collective. He serves as a board member for Open Food Network USA, and he is a co-chair of Block's Bay Area Neurodiversity Community. He lives with his partner Veronica and their dog Molly in San Francisco, California. In his free time, Joe likes to read, travel, hike, kayak, practice martial arts, and skateboard. You can find Joe on LinkedIn, Twitter, and GitHub. So let's get started. I'll hand over the slides and the microphone and camera to Joe.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So let me just share my screen. Can you all see my screen? I think so. Okay, I'm going to go into slideshow mode. All right. Thanks again for that intro. I'm so excited to be here today to give everyone an introduction to the Django framework. And so a little bit about myself. I already had an intro, so I won't spend too much time here on this. But I've been doing software development for over 10 years. I've worked with many different web frameworks, including Django, Ruby on Rails, Sinatra, React, Ember. A lot of these are funny names. We're going to hear a lot of them in this presentation. I've been working across multiple industries using these technologies, including agricultural technology, sustainability, financial services. I've also worked on cross-platform projects for mobile and desktop applications using React Native, Cordova, and Electron.js. And my day job, I work as a full-time software engineer at Square, and I'm also a co-founder of Sustainable Progress and Equality Collective, which I'll also talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And I spend a lot of my time doing mentoring, career coaching, and tutoring in software engineering. And so what is Django? Why are we here to talk about this framework today? Django is a free and open source software based on Python for web development. It helps simplify the complexity of building web applications, and it emphasizes reusability, pluggability, less code, low coupling, rapid development, and the principle of don't repeat yourself. Django is used across the software development industry at companies like Mozilla, Instagram, Discus, and a bunch more. And I know there's a lot of buzzwords in here and software engineering terms like reusability, components, coupling. We're going to talk a lot about that today and really make sure you understand kind of the bones that go into what Django is. So before we get farther along, you probably have the question, where did Django come from? Like I said, a lot of software developers pick fun names for their projects. This is like that. The two founders, Adrian and Simon, were developers. Adrian was interested or liked a particular guitarist, jazz guitarist, Django Reinhardt, and decided to name the framework after him. And so before we get on, I have this quote here. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Django and web development is really complex, and there's a lot of words that you can get in acronyms you can get hung up on. So I'm going to try my best to break down Django from the ground up and get to the point where we all kind of understand the language that goes into web development. And so with that, this is kind of an overview of what we're going to be looking here today. We're going to start with a 10,000-foot view of web development with Django. Once we cover kind of the basics and fundamentals of Django, and the primitives really, like Python and web development core concepts, we'll build a small Django application from the ground up. We'll talk a little bit about how to get Django out into the real world and deploying it to the internet, and then finally do a recap of what we've learned. And at each point, we'll have a couple minutes for questions before we move on. And so we'll start with a 10,000-foot view of web development with Django. So we'll talk a little bit about open source software licensing and how Django is licensed, the Python programming language, which you kind of need to know to understand Django because it's based on the Python language, and then go over some fundamentals of web development and web development frameworks. And so we'll start with open source. Open source software is software that can be used in most cases free of charge. Anyone's can use it freely licensed to use, copy, study, and change the software in any way. There are different types of licenses that have certain restrictions on whether it can be used for commercial or non-commercial use. And this is really in contrast with the way a lot of software is made, where the copyrights are restrictive and only users can use it in certain ways. And so how is Django licensed? It's using a type of open source license called BSD license, which comes after the namesake Berkeley Software Distribution, which was a early Unix operating system distribution. And it has various disclaimers about the reuse, but in general, it's considered a very liberal policy for use. And obviously, tons of companies and individuals are using Python every day or Django every day to develop commercial applications. And so we're going to switch to talking about the Python programming language because it's so core to Django. And so if you're not familiar with Python, we'll do just a really quick deep dive, or rather a high-level overview of Python. Python's a high-level interpreted dynamically typed general-purpose programming language. It was designed with a philosophy that emphasizes readability, and it's kind of known for the way that it uses indentations versus brackets and semicolons to demark the end of statements. And so the easiest way to kind of understand that is to take a look at an example of code, which we will do. And these are kind of the high-level pieces we're going to talk about with Python to be able to get to Django. And so we'll start with the characteristics of Python. I mentioned it's high-level, interpreted, dynamically typed, and general purpose. And when we look at Python, we have an example here where this is a very basic example of writing an average function. And you can see here we're defining a method or function, and you were using the indentation to demark this statement where we're calculating the sum, getting the number of items in that set, and then dividing the two values. And we can also see declaration of a data structure, in this case, an array or a list in the Python world that has integers that are in that array. We're calling that function we defined. We're calling another function to round that value, and then we're printing it out to the console. And so that's a very, basic Python example, but really shows the expressiveness of the language. And so if we ran that code from the console, it would look something like this, where it actually prints out the average grade from that function and the percentage. And so when we're talking about high level, what we mean is what we just saw, which is that we were able to describe a program fairly succinctly without any kind of references to the underlying machine. And the high level, low level description is kind of up for debate. If I have here for high level languages, Python, Ruby, JavaScript, and SAS. But if you see here low level, assembly, C and C++, early in development, someone would scoff if you said C or C++ was low level, because assembly is such a more complex or lower level language. But now with the development of high level languages like Python, you're able to really do a ton of different things without thinking about considerations like memory management or the underlying machine's instruction set architecture, very low level concepts. So Python's very high level. We don't have to worry about those types of considerations. And here's just an example of like another high-level pattern. We're defining a data structure. We don't have to define anything about how much memory this is going to take up. And then we're able to define some logic that reads very much like natural language, right? For passenger, in passengers, we're going to go through each item in that list, and then we're applying some kind of conditional if-else statement in order to achieve some goal. And so we didn't have to do anything. We don't really have to talk or think about the computer when we're writing Python for the most part. Python's also interpreted, which means that when it's running, it's already a software kind of sitting around that understands Python code and then runs it, where interpreted is in opposite of something like compiled programming languages, where the compiler will read that code and generate some representation of the code that can be run by machine code. And so the Python interpreter is installed on your computer, and it's really running almost like a virtual machine that takes Python code and runs it then. And this gives you a lot of flexibility in the way that you write code and what kind of environments it can run in. And like I said, the interpreter is a virtual machine. So it's actually emulating a computer, and it has its own instruction set that Python will generate and run. But Python uses a stack machine, which means that it's holding these data structures in memory versus actually writing things directly to a register. In practice, we won't really have to dig much into the interpreter and virtual machine, but it's good to understand kind of what we're talking about when we say it's interpreted. What's probably more important is when we talk about Python is its general purpose nature. And it supports multiple programming paradigms, and we'll talk a second about those paradigms. But in general, Python's kind of a batteries included language where its standard library, all the functions that come out of the box when you get it, is fairly comprehensive, and you can do a lot of stuff just with Python by itself. And so one paradigm that we'll see a lot when we get into Django is object-oriented programming. And here's an example of a usage of that in Python, where we're defining some type of class. It would be the terminology to model an object, in this case, a blog post. And it takes some properties itself, and then you can add additional methods or functions that are part of that model to do something. In this case, it's truncating some of the content of the blog post. Then I initialize this instance of this object, and now I have a instance of this post. And then I can call those different attributes on that, the title, and I'm printing out the title, printing out the content. And here I'm calling a method on that class that's truncating the string. And so this is a really powerful pattern that you see in software engineering, and Django and other frameworks heavily use object-oriented programming. Python also allows for functional programming. I'm not going to really dig into programming paradigms, but this is just an example of a very expressive definition of using functional programming, where you're able to do composition of functions and do a lot in very short amount of code. And so you'll see those paradigms as well in Django. And then we'll talk about dynamic typing. And so dynamic typing means that the Python interpreter checks the types of the data. We'll talk about this, but in general, if you're defining a variable or a function, it's going to have a data type, whether it's an individual character, a string of characters, an integer value, a decimal value. And Python won't check those types until the program is running. And so for something like a compiled language that does static analysis ahead of time, that means that the compiler won't even complete the compilation process to enable the program to be run, because there's an issue with types. And so what that means in practice is if you have a type issue, like you're trying to compare a string of characters with an integer, Python won't know about it until you've run the code and it hits that line in question. And so this is one challenge of dynamically typed programming languages like Python, that means you can introduce bugs in your code that you don't know about until the code is run. There are pros and cons to this. Typed languages tend to be a little bit more difficult to write because there's more code because you're explicitly defining types, but it does prevent you from creating type issues. And so just a little bit more about data types, because we're going to see them over and over again. This is the same program that we looked at previously, but here where I'm just annotating the different data types that we have. So here we have an array. This is going to be a float value. This is going to be a string value. And this function takes an array as a value, and these functions return integers, and this division will return a float. So that's what we're talking about data types in the language that usually you're manipulating, or almost always manipulating some type of data that has a data type. And then this is just an example of what we're saying about a runtime error when we're running into a type issue. So here I'm trying to divide a number by a string, and this is saying that that's not a thing. And so Python is giving us some useful information about what the type error is. I mentioned Python standard library. This is in practice how you access that. You're able to use a line like this: from math, import a specific function. And Python's standard library is very large and well documented, so you can kind of see all the things. But in this case, we're just using one of the functions to calculate the product. And you can see this function takes an array as a data type and returns a value. And so while Python's standard library is really powerful, what really supercharges the language and gets us to the point to use something like Django is external packages. And so Python has a package manager called pip that allows you to download external packages, which mainly are open source, but there are private packages as well. It also allows you to install packages locally that you might have designed yourself. And so an example of using pip, this assumes you already have Python installed on your computer, is pip install and the package name, and you can do multiple packages. So in this case, I'm installing NumPy, Matplotlib, SciPy, and statistics. And then similarly to the standard library example, we can import those various packages and then use them to do something. In this case, visualize a normal distribution visually. And so the other thing that we'll want to talk about before we kind of move on to web development is we just talked about installing modules or dependencies. When you're getting to the point of developing multiple Python projects or actually developing a project for production, sometimes we want to isolate those different instances. We might want to have one project using Python 2 because it depends on an older package, or we might want to have one that's Python 3 and has its own environment. And so virtual environments gives us a light way to encapsulate Python and all its dependencies and keep them separate, both from other types of Python, as well as in most cases, your computer probably has Python already installed and is used as part of a core library. So you don't want to really mess with the default installation of Python on your computer. And so venv is a module that comes with the newer versions of Python. And in practice, it looks like something like this, where you say Python 3, you define an environment, and then you can activate that environment on Mac or Linux. It would look something like this, and on Windows, something like this. And once you execute this command, it basically will take over your terminal and use that version of Python and its dependencies that you've installed with pip. And so now we've kind of covered the Python stuff. And before we go on, I do want to say that, Python, everything that we're going to look at with Django is enabled by Python's standard library and all of those other dependencies. And so you could build probably a small web app with just Python's basic dependencies, but you really need to learn a lot more in order to get to the point of developing a web application. And that's really where web frameworks come in. And so before we get into web frameworks, I do want to stop for a second and see if there's any questions about Python before we continue on. And Beryl, I don't know if you want to ask